North of Houston, there's a place called Spring, Texas. But on July 9th, 2014, on a hot, humid summer day, nothing could have prepared this community or the Stay family for what was about to happen. 15-year-old Cassidy Stay was home with her 4 younger siblings when there was a knock at the door. She opened it to a man in a FedEx uniform holding a package, one that looked oddly like a pillow wrapped in duct tape. She didn't recognize him at first. He had a beard, but then she heard the voice. This wasn't a stranger. This was her uncle, her aunt's ex-husband, Ronald Lee Haskell. Cassidy told him her parents weren't home, and he left, but only for a few minutes. Then he came back, forced his way inside, and ordered the children into the living room at gunpoint. He waited for Cassidy's parents, Stephen and Katie, to return. When they walked in, they barely had a second to react before Haskell forced them too, at gunpoint, into the living room. He ordered the entire family to lie face down on the floor. Then, one by one, he shot them, including Cassidy, who was wounded in the head and hand. She survived by playing dead until Ron Haskell left the house. Cassidy then called 911. What followed was a police chase and a tense, hours-long standoff that ended in Ron Haskell's arrest. But the story that unfolded in the days and years after that night at the Stay family home isn't straightforward. This isn't a whodunit. We know exactly who did it. The bigger questions are why, and maybe even more unsettling, why after years of red flags and warnings, no one stopped him. Why did it take the courage of a 15-year-old girl to finally put an end to her uncle's rampage? We're going to get to all of that. But first, let's start at the beginning. Before we get into today's episode, I want to let you know that you can get uncensored versions of this podcast, along with early access by becoming a Patreon member. If you enjoy the podcast, please check it out at patreon.com/beachhouse34. Spring, Texas sits just north of Houston. It's a place that's pretty historic, with an area called Old Town Spring that houses over 100 family-run shops, things like ice cream parlors, boutiques, the kind of storefronts that look like they've been there forever. They also have the Spring Creek Greenway, which winds for miles. It's kind of like this ribbon of hiking and biking trails through thick woods. There are farms where you can pick your own strawberries. There's an exotic wildlife park, even vineyards. Neighbors will tell you it's the kind of community where minivans wear soccer decals, families gather for weekend barbecues, and crime always feels like it's something that happened someplace else. The Stay family was deeply rooted in Spring, Texas. Stephen and Katie Stay were raising their 5 children there, ages 4 to 15. They were active in their church, and Stephen Stay volunteered as a coach for the local special needs baseball league. Katie Stay organized charity drives, and when her sister Melannie needed help escaping an abusive marriage, Katie was the one who stepped in. But the story that would ultimately upend their lives didn't start in Texas. It began hundreds of miles away in Logan, Utah, with Ron Haskell, Katie's brother-in-law. In 2003, Ron married Melannie, Katie's sister. What followed was a slow, steady escalation. His behavior grew more controlling, more volatile, until by 2008, things had gotten so bad that Ron had dragged Melannie by her hair and hit her right in front of their children, all over an argument about chores. This wasn't a single moment of violence. It was the start of a pattern, one that would cross state lines and eventually come crashing into the heart of Spring's tight-knit community. Now, Ron, he was charged with domestic violence and assault, But in the end, he pleaded guilty to assault, avoiding jail time. It was a pattern, a slap on the wrist, and then another, and then another. For the next 5 years, Melannie would file multiple protective orders, and Ron's rage only got worse. He saw the divorce coming. Melannie filed in October of 2013. He knew that she was taking the kids, and by all accounts, he was devastated. He left for San Marcos, California, to stay with family. And while he was there, he reportedly spent most of his days in bed, deeply depressed and at times suicidal. Meanwhile, Melannie moved with the children to Spring, Texas, hoping for a fresh start. Katie Stay, Melannie's sister, was determined to protect her family. She helped Melannie and her 4 children relocate to Spring, Texas in late 2013, hoping that putting miles between them and Ron would keep him away. But they were wrong. Just days before the murders, Ron was still in Southern California. He became enraged when he learned that his mother had been in contact with Melannie. He duct taped his mother's wrists, tied her to a computer chair, and choked her until she passed out. He threatened to kill her, the rest of the family, and any officer who tried to intervene. He hid her phones and kept her taped up for over 4 hours. When his sister tried to step in, he attacked her too, throwing her to the ground and punching her. And even when his mother, Carla, did secure an emergency protective order against him later, after he duct taped her to this chair and choked her unconscious, just 6 days before the murders, California authorities couldn't locate him to make an arrest. When Melannie's divorce from Ron was finalized in February of 2014, the court granted her full custody of the children. There was a catch, though. Ron was allowed supervised visits, but only if a therapist signed off. Now, here's where the legal system gets a little tangled. Under federal law, if someone is under a certain type of domestic violence restraining order, they're not supposed to have access to firearms. That's pretty clear. But when a divorce is finalized and the court moves from a protective order to a supervised visitation arrangement, especially one that's conditional, like in this case, unless the order specifically says no guns, the federal gun ban doesn't automatically apply anymore. And that's exactly what happened with Ron. After the divorce, the original protective order was replaced by what's called a mutual restraining order and this supervised visitation plan, which was contingent on therapist approval. Because this new setup didn't explicitly prohibit him from having firearms, and because the original restraining order was no longer in effect, Ron was no longer automatically barred from owning or buying guns under federal law. The risk was still there, but the legal safeguard was now gone. Ron Haskell didn't just wake up one day and decide to show up at the Stays family doorstep. This was weeks in the making. It was meticulously planned. He started by going back to Utah and stealing a gun from an ex-girlfriend, and then he went out and bought 200 rounds of hollow point ammunition. That odd duct-taped pillow that Cassidy saw the so-called FedEx guy holding when she answered that door, that was Ron's homemade silencer. But he didn't stop there. When Ron arrived at the Stay house at 5:03 p.m., he was also carrying a package. This package contained zip ties, a hunting knife, and extra magazines for the gun. This was a man who came prepared. When he arrived at the Stay home, Cassidy, the oldest of all of the siblings, was just baking cookies. She opened the door, didn't recognize him at first because he had that beard, and she thought that maybe this was someone delivering a late birthday gift for her mom. But after she told him her parents weren't home, he left. Only for a few minutes, though. He came back, forced his way inside, and grabbed Cassidy by the wrist so hard it left bruises. He demanded to know where Melannie, Cassidy's aunt, was. Then, at gunpoint, he ordered Cassidy to gather her brothers and sisters and wait in the living room for their parents to come home. And they waited. For 47 minutes, Cassidy and her 4 siblings sat in their own living room, held at gunpoint by a man they now recognized as Uncle Ron, or maybe more accurately, former Uncle Ron. It's hard to imagine the terror in that room. To keep the kids quiet, Haskell actually put on a movie, something to distract them, as he paced back and forth, checking his watch and waiting for their parents to come home. Cassidy would later testify that she tried to reach him to appeal to whatever humanity might be left. She told him all of their names and their ages, saying, "We're just kids." Haskell, she recalled, stared at her like she was speaking another language. At 5:50 p.m., Katie and Stephen Stay returned from running errands. Katie froze in the doorway, the grocery bags slipping from her hands as the reality of the scene hit her. She recognized Haskell immediately. There was no confusion, no time wasted, and Katie lunged for the gun. Haskell slammed her head against the wall hard enough to fracture her eye socket. He then forced the entire family face down on the carpet and bound their hands with zip ties. Haskell started with Stephen. He stood over him, put the barrel of the gun to Stephen's skull, and tried to use that pillow as a makeshift silencer. Stephen, just 39 years old, was shot twice, once in the head, once in the torso. Later, investigators found a bullet lodged in his wallet, piercing a family photo. Katie, 33, was next. She fought him. She fought as hard as she could until Haskell finally pinned her down. She was shot in the mouth, through her hand, and in the back of the head. The autopsy would show defensive wounds on her palms, her teeth knocked out by the bullet. 13-year-old Brian tried to crawl over to his dad. He was shot in the back of the head. His body was found draped over his little brother, Zach, who was just 4. Zach had been grazed in the shoulder at first, but he too crawled to his father's body. Haskell fired a final shot into his temple. 9-year-old Emily and 7-year-old Rebecca were huddled together. Each was shot in the back of the head. 15-year-old Cassidy was also shot in the back of the head, but she instinctively put up her hand to protect herself. The bullet grazed her head and finger, fracturing her skull and injuring her finger, but that split-second movement changed the bullet's trajectory, just enough to save her life. Cassidy then played dead until Haskell left the house. Only then did she call 911. Later in court, Cassidy described the aftermath. Quote, "The room smelled like copper. I could taste blood in my mouth. Zach was whimpering, then silence." All throughout the attack, Ron Haskell was relentless. Over and over, he demanded to know where his ex-wife, Melannie, and their children were. He was fixated, convinced that Melannie might be hiding at her parents' house, just a few miles away. That was his next stop. After shooting the Stay family, Ron reloaded his gun and took off in the family's red 2012 Honda Pilot. His destination? The home of Katie's parents, his former in-laws, and in his mind, the next link to Melannie. At 6:12 p.m., Cassidy Stay made the 911 call that would change everything. That call triggered a rapid response, what became a 22-minute police chase through the streets of Spring. Officers spotted the Honda Pilot near the grandparents' home and tried to pull it over, but Ron fled. Nearly 24 patrol cars joined in the pursuit. At one point, police deployed spike strips, successfully flattening a back tire, but Ron kept driving. Then, a mistake. He turned down a cul-de-sac. Officers boxed him in with 2 armored vehicles and quickly evacuated the neighborhood. For more than 3 hours, Ron sat in the car, holding a gun to his own head, refusing to come out. He wasn't disconnected from reality. If anything, he was calculating. He insisted on speaking to his brother, a chief of police in Alaska, and even commented on the position of police snipers, showing just how aware he was of the tactical situation. Police tried everything, including playing recordings of his children's voices over a loudspeaker, hoping to reach him. Finally, after hours of negotiation over the phone, Ron surrendered at 9:29 p.m. As officers took him into custody, he muttered, "Joseph told me to do it," a reference to the voice his defense would later claim had been calling the shots all along. When police then arrived at the Stay family home, they described what they saw as nothing short of a war zone. Blood pooled around the bodies. Shell casings were scattered across the floor. The duct tape pillow used as a makeshift silencer was now shredded and lay beside Katie Stay's body. In Ron's car, investigators found evidence that left no doubt about his intentions. Handwritten addresses for Melanie's relatives, a timeline for the murders, and the words "no witnesses" scrawled in block letters. This wasn't a man acting on impulse. This was careful and calculated. The level of preparation was chilling. Haskell had disabled the home's security system ahead of time. He parked his rental car 2 blocks away to avoid drawing attention. He wore gloves so he wouldn't leave fingerprints. But there was one thing he didn't plan for: Cassidy surviving. As the investigation unfolded, police then retraced Ron's steps in the days leading up to the shooting. He had traveled from California, stopped in Utah to steal a firearm from an ex-girlfriend and buy more than 200 rounds of ammunition. Court records filled in the rest: a long history of domestic violence, protective orders, and mental health crises. In 2008, he was convicted of assault after dragging his then-wife Melannie by the hair in front of their kids. This protective order, filed in 2013, was later dismissed and then replaced with that mutual restraining order during the divorce. What's maybe even more troubling is this: multiple family members had seen Ron's volatility up close for years, but the authorities were rarely called. Take his sister. He allegedly choked her in 2013, but she never pressed any charges. And Melanie's protective order from that same year, it was downgraded to a mutual order after Ron claimed that she was the aggressor. Now, advocates will tell you that's a classic move in abusive relationships, turning the tables and muddying the waters. A domestic violence expert was brought in by prosecutors, and they put it really plainly. Families often minimize the danger because they don't want to believe someone they love could do this. But in Ron's case, the signals weren't just missed, they were ignored. Ron's trial finally began in 2019, and this was 5 years after the murders. The delay kind of speaks volumes as to how complicated this case was, the sheer volume of evidence, the media attention, and the defense's repeated requests for psychiatric evaluations and continuances. The courtroom was packed, as you might imagine. Reporters, family members, neighbors from Spring, all of them looking for answers. And the prosecution wasted no time. Their case was all about premeditation and vengeance. They argued that what happened wasn't the result of a sudden psychotic break. It was a calculated, methodical attack aimed at anyone who dared to help Ron's ex-wife escape his control. They laid out, piece by piece, the evidence of Ron's planning: the stolen gun, the homemade silencer, the FedEx uniform, the timeline, the threats. They played Cassidy's 911 call for the jury. They brought in forensic experts, police officers, and Cassidy herself. The prosecution's experts were very blunt. Ron was faking it. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he planned every step. The defense didn't dispute that Ron had killed the Stay family. Their whole case was about his mental state, his diagnoses of bipolar disorder and schizoaffective disorder. They argued that he wasn't truly responsible for his actions, that he was a man who was lost to his own mind. But at the center of all of this was Cassidy Stay. Her testimony wasn't just important, it was the backbone of the entire case. Cassidy gave the jury a clear, detailed account of what happened: how she begged her uncle not to hurt her family, how he forced them to lie face down, how she survived by playing dead. Her composure and clarity in the face of unimaginable trauma became the heart of the state's argument. Think about it. A teenager faced not only with her own death, but the loss of her entire family, somehow finds the strength to call 911 and later to face her family's killer in court. That's a level of courage and presence of mind that's hard to fathom and impossible not to respect. The trial hinged on one central question: was this a man acting out of psychosis, or was this just pure vengeance? The defense leaned hard into the mental illness angle. They brought in psychiatric evaluations stretching back to 2008, diagnoses, reports of hearing voices, a supposed presence named Joseph, who allegedly ordered him to cleanse his ex-wife's family. But the prosecution dismantled that narrative, pointing to Ron's careful planning, his tactical awareness during the standoff, and the fact that he only began to mention this person, Joseph, after his arrest. He had never done that once in years of psychiatric evaluations. In the end, the jury was not convinced, and after less than 2 hours of deliberation, they found Ronald Lee Haskell guilty of capital murder. In the penalty phase, the same jury heard even more about Ron's violent past, the devastation left behind for the Stay family, and the risk that he still posed to society. Cassidy, by this point, she was now a young woman, and she stood up and read her victim impact statement, saying, "You've been in control long enough, and now your game is up. You're not in control anymore. You've lost, and this is it for you." Ron Haskell was sentenced to death by lethal injection. He was sent to the Allen B. Polunsky Unit, Texas's death row, to wait. If you follow true crime, obviously, you know that a death sentence is almost never the end of the story. Ron Haskell's defense team wasted no time launching the appeals process, arguing that his history of mental illness and what they called mishandling of evidence should be enough to win him a new trial, or at the very least, spare him from execution. Now, in Texas, appeals in capital cases aren't just a formality. They can drag on for years, sometimes decades. And Ron's case has followed that script to the letter. Then, in 2024, the Haskell case took a turn that no one saw coming. Harris County District Court Judge Natalia Cornelio found herself at the center of a legal and ethical firestorm, accused by prosecutors of showing bias in favor of Ron Haskell, the man convicted of murdering 6 members of the Stay family. At the heart of this was a secret bench warrant. This was quietly issued by Judge Cornelio that allowed Haskell to be transported off of death row and back to Harris County to have a private medical scan. Now, neither the prosecution nor the victims' families were notified. There was no public hearing. There was no docket entry. This was a midnight court setting that never actually happened. During his nearly 3-week stay at the Harris County Jail, Haskell was quietly taken to a private imaging clinic for an MRI. Body camera footage later showed him, a death row inmate, sitting in a waiting room just feet from unsuspecting members of the public. No handcuffs, no clear indication of the risk that he posed, and even Haskell himself, in a recorded jail call to his mother, described the whole operation as cloak and dagger. The only reason that the DA's office or the Stay family found out at all was because Cassidy Stay received an automated Vine notification that Haskell had been moved off of death row. Now, let's talk about this. If you've never heard of it, you're not alone. But for victims and their families, it can be a lifeline. Vine stands for Victim Information and Notification Every Day. It's a system designed to do one thing: keep people informed when an offender's status changes. And we're talking about real-time alerts. If someone is released from jail, transferred to another facility, or even escapes, the system sends out a notification. Phone, email, text, you pick how you want to be reached. But here's the thing. As powerful as Vine is, it's only as good as the information it receives. If the system isn't updated, or if someone forgets to enter a transfer, that all-important notification never goes out. When the prosecution started looking at this closer, they saw a pattern. Secret orders from the judge, decisions made without the other side in the room, the defense, and a lot of behind-the-scenes moves that kept the state and the victims' families out of the loop. And then there was the judge's own history. Years before she ever took the bench, she had made her opposition to the death penalty very clear, telling a senior prosecutor that she was disgusted that Texas still used the death penalty and referred to Haskell as being sick, making it clear that in her view, even a crime as brutal as the Stay family murders didn't equate to the death penalty. In the middle of all of this, the prosecutors asked to have Judge Cornelio taken off the case. They argued that she wasn't acting like a fair and neutral judge anymore. She was acting more like she was on Ron's side. And the defense pushed back, saying there was no real proof that she was biased. But by then, the story had already taken off. The press was all over it, with both sides accusing each other of kind of messing with the fairness of the whole process. In January of 2025, so just a few months ago, Judge Susan Brown agreed with the prosecutors and officially removed Judge Cornelio from the case. And the district attorney's office put it pretty plainly: the victims of Ron Haskell were never going to get a fair chance. As of now, Ron Haskell remains on death row. His appeals are still making their way through the courts. And this controversy over judicial conduct hasn't changed the facts of this case, but it's added yet another layer to a process that's already, bogged down by delays and legal hurdles. For the people who survived, the court battles are just one part of a much bigger story of pain. Cassidy's Stay, almost by accident, has become a symbol of strength. Since the murders, she has talked openly about her family, her faith, and her promise to live in a way that honors those she lost. She finished high school, went to college, and now speaks up for victims of domestic violence and gun violence. In interviews, she said, "I choose to be happy. I choose to move forward. That's what my family would have wanted." The community in Spring has struggled too. The house where it all happened was eventually sold, but neighbors still remember that day. The helicopters, the sirens, and the shock of realizing that something this terrible could happen so close to home. There have been memorials, vigils, and support from local churches for the family that was left behind. This case left a mark. It's a reminder that even in places where everyone feels safe, violence can happen, especially when warning signs are ignored. We started this story with a knock at the door, one ordinary moment that changed everything for the Stay family. It's the kind of detail that sticks with you. Most of us answer the door without a second thought, never imagining that something terrible could be waiting on the other side. After the murders, it's natural to want closure, the kind that we see in movies, the bad guy caught, the system fixed, the survivors somehow okay. But real life doesn't work that way. And Ron Haskell is on death row, but the questions about how he even got to that doorstep are still with us. How does someone with a long history of violence and warning signs slip through every safety net? Why did restraining orders, police reports, and hospital stays fail when it mattered the most? Why did it take a 15-year-old girl, wounded and scared, to do what the system couldn't? Stop a massacre. I keep thinking about what Cassidy said in court. You've been in control long enough, now your game is up. The real question isn't just whether justice was done, but whether we're willing to take back control, especially those that are in domestic violence situations. To take back control from fear, from indifference, and from the idea that it could never happen where you are. Because the truth is, it can. It did. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, help is available. You can reach the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 800-799-7233. You're not alone, and there are people ready to listen. Before we wrap up today, I want to let you know about what's coming next. Beginning June 19th, 2025, I'll be releasing some new trial readings, 2 or 3 episodes a week, and they'll be available to Patreon members before anyone else. Each week, Patreon supporters will get early access, but don't worry, every episode will go public about a week after its Patreon debut. So whether you're a longtime supporter or just tuning in, you won't miss a thing. The case I'll be covering is Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey. If those names ring a bell, it's probably because you remember the Netflix documentary, Making a Murderer. I'm guessing most of you have seen it, but if it's been a while, let me just say, it's a story that's hard to shake. When I first watched, I ran the gamut. Shock, outrage, heartbreak. And I'll be honest, watching Brendan Dassey's interrogation, seeing a scared kid alone in that room, stayed with me long after the show was over. Few things in true crime have hit me quite like that. In the meantime, you'll still get your regular true crime episodes here. Some will be updated and remastered from the early days, so if you remember those first releases, I promise they're going to sound a lot better this time around. Thank you, truly. Thank you all for listening and supporting this work. If you want more stories like these, hit like, subscribe, and share with a friend. We'll talk again soon. Bye for now.